Hi guys. Today we are going to talk about our first topic in our diabetes investigation, which is sugar and fat. So in order to talk about this, we need to think about what the human body is made of. 96% of our body, the matter in our body, remember we talked about how matter is the stuff, the atoms that things are made of. Well, the atoms that our body is made of are mostly four elements: hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Now, if you look at the picture, that's not actually in the order of amount, but the reason I said them in that order is because they spell the word honk, and that will help you remember them. Now, if we look, it's actually oxygen that is the biggest percentage, and this is by mass. So if you're weighing yourself, the biggest percentage by mass is oxygen, and a lot of that is the water in our body. And then comes carbon, then hydrogen, and then nitrogen. Then, of course, the other 4% of our body is made of lots of other elements that are, of course, very important, but these are the four most important. Now, when we hook all of these atoms together and these elements and rearrange them, we make what are called molecules. Molecules are just atoms that are bonded together, and the important molecules in our body are called biological molecules because they're the important molecules for living things. Now, in order to make these molecules, it's like putting beads on a string or playing with Legos. We have small parts that we call monomers. Mono means one, and we put them together to make polymers. Poly means many. So for example, this little building block here is called a monomer, and I can put it together. I can put two of them together, or maybe several of them, six of them together, in different arrangements. And all of those different arrangements of the pieces stuck together are polymers. Now, the one in this picture is not a biological molecule, it's just an example. But when we look at our biological molecules, all of them have smaller parts, monomers, that we put together to make polymers. Now, the four main biological molecules are carbohydrates, that's one of the ones we're going to talk about today, and lipids, otherwise known as fats. Then two that we will talk about in later units are proteins and nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are things like DNA and RNA. So today we are going to think about carbohydrates and lipids, and down the road we will think about proteins and nucleic acids. But if you happen to Google this for more information, usually these four things are grouped together because they're the four main biological molecules. And I underlined the first letter there because we sometimes think of it as clappin or clippin to help us remember the names of the four molecules. Now, how does this connect to diabetes? Well, we already saw that high sugar diets can be one of the things that can lead to type 2 diabetes, and sugars are a type of carbohydrate. Remember, that's one of the molecules we'll be talking about today. And if you eat too much sugar, that can make you fat, that can cause obesity, and fats are lipids. So if we know more about carbohydrates and lipids and how they work, we'll be able to make a better connection with the carbohydrates and lipids and how they're involved in type 2 diabetes. So first, let's look at what are they for? What are the main functions of carbs and lipids, starting with carbs? So carbohydrates have three main functions. The one that probably we think of first is quick energy. Then they are also used for energy storage. And finally, the structure of plants. So by quick energy, think of sugar rush. If you want energy very quickly in your body for food, sugars, carbohydrates are the way to go. In energy storage, there's a little bit of energy storage in our bodies, which we'll talk about later. But plants quite commonly store energy for use later as carbohydrates, like potatoes. And then finally, plants do not have skeletons like we do, but they need something to hold them up, and they actually use carbohydrates to do that. Lipids, on the other hand, have different functions. They're also used for energy, but rather than being quick energy, they're used for storing energy for later use, long-term energy storage. Now, they're also involved in cell structure, and many of our hormones are lipids, not all, but some of them are proteins, but some of them are lipids. And then finally, insulation. So long-term energy, that's basically the fat on our body. That's your long-term energy storage. Also, fat doesn't have to be animals like us. Things like avocados and nuts also have lipids for long-term energy storage. And cell structure, the membrane of your cell, the outside of the cell, is actually made of a special type of lipid. Hormones, that's a picture of estrogen. Sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone are lipids. And finally, insulation. So we have a little bit of insulation, but especially animals that live in cold climates like this whale here or polar bears have a lot of fat on their bodies to help keep them warm. All right, now let's think about how they're made. This is where those monomers and polymers come in. So carbohydrate has a monomer. Remember, that's the small, like the bead that you'll put on the string or the single Lego. It's called a monosaccharide. Mono means one and saccharide means sugar. So it means one sugar. There's a couple polymers that we'll think about in this class. The first one is a disaccharide, which means two sugars because di means two, or a polysaccharide. Poly means many, as we saw with polymer. So a single sugar we often draw as a hexagon because the most common sugar in our body is glucose, which has a hexagon shape. So when you see that hexagon, you should think sugar. A monosaccharide, of course, is just one of those. A disaccharide is two of those hooked together. That has a special name because there are many sort of important common disaccharides that are in our diet. And then finally, when we hook lots of them together, that's a polysaccharide. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, when we're looking at pictures, because I will ask you sometimes to identify different types of molecules in pictures, you can recognize carbohydrates by their hexagon shape or sometimes their pentagon shape. So basically, they're sort of geometric shape. Lipids, on the other hand, also have monomers and polymers, but they look very different. So the monomers for lipids, there's two of them. They're called glycerol and fatty acids. And when we put them together, there's lots of different polymers, but the ones that we're going to focus on are triglycerides and phospholipids. I know those are long names. So the tri and triglyceride, you'll see there's a reason for it. It means three. And phospholipid is because it has this phosphate section is the phospho part, and then lipid, of course, because it's a lipid. So the glycerol is it often looks sort of like the head of the molecule, and then the fatty acids are like tails. So the triglyceride actually has three fatty acid tails. That's where the tri or three comes from. This is the most common type of fat in our bodies. Now the phospholipid, that orange part, the circle, that's the phosphate head. That's where the phospho comes from. And it has two fatty acid tails. So you may have noticed that those tails, those fatty acids, those are the things that can help us recognize lipids. Now, not every lipid has a fatty acid tail, but many of them do. So if you see that long sort of, wavy tail, you know that that's probably a lipid. All right, let's look at some examples of both of these, carbohydrates and lipids. Excuse me. All right, sugars. When we say sugar, what we're actually talking about is mono and disaccharides. So all the sugars we eat are either monosaccharides or disaccharides. And these are the ones that are our body's preferred quick energy. And you can recognize sugars when you see the name because they always end in ose, O-S-E. So sucrose, for example, is when I say sugar, you're probably thinking of sucrose. That's table sugar. That's like what you'd put in your cookies or your coffee. And you can see that's a disaccharide because it has two sugars. Glucose is the body's most important sugar. This is what your body prefers to use for energy. You can see that's a monosaccharide, a simple sugar. And that is the sugar in your blood. So when people talk about high or low blood sugar, like we do when we're talking about diabetes, we're talking about glucose. Fructose is another monosaccharide, and this is very common in fruit. You can kind of tell that from the name, but it's found in other things, not just fruit. And One other thing that it's found in is honey, which is actually about half glucose and half fructose. And then finally, another one that you're probably familiar with is lactose, which is another disaccharide, which is a milk sugar and obviously found in milk. Now remember, polysaccharides are many sugars hooked together, and some polysaccharides are for energy storage. One that we eat a lot of is starch, which is a way that plants store energy. Potatoes and the wheat that goes into pasta, that is starch. And the way we personally store energy in polysaccharides is called glycogen. And we store our glycogen in our liver and our muscles. And this is a place that we're able to sort of get a quick backup energy source that's faster than using fats. So there's some pasta for you. And that is what a starch molecule looks like a zoomed in little piece of it. And then remember I said that it's in our muscles and liver. For example, when you sprint, your body will start breaking down the glycogen in your muscles to give you a quick energy source without having to, find it in other parts of the body. It helps us if you're running away from a lion. And then the liver, when you have your hormone signals from your pancreas, remember we learned about our feedback loops, the glucagon will tell the liver to break down glycogen and release more sugar into your blood when you have low blood sugar. And that is what your glycogen looks like. Now, you may notice that both glycogen and starch have these sort of branches, and that's because it's easy for your body or the plant's, not body, but the plant cells to clip off little bits, little sugars, individual monosaccharides when they need energy from the branching molecules. They're easy to break down and they're easy to build back up again. So that's why they're good for energy storage. Now, some polysaccharides are not for energy storage. Remember, the third function of carbohydrates was plant structure. So plants, their skeleton, not actually a skeleton, but what keeps them up is made of cellulose. And cellulose is a polysaccharide. And when we eat cellulose, we actually usually call it fiber. So what we call fiber is actually what keeps the plant cell walls, that keeps them up straight. But we can't digest it very well. It's important for our digestion in the sense that we can't digest it and helps move things through the digestive system. Plus, it helps feed the bacteria that live in our gut. Now, there are also some animals that use polysaccharides in their structure, and this polysaccharide is called chitin, and also fungi, which are not plants or animals. They're their own category, their own kingdom. But the animals that use chitin are bugs, arthropods. So the cell walls of plants are made of cellulose, and this is sort of a zoomed in cellulose. You can see it is a long strip of sugars all hooked together in a line. And then fungi like mushrooms and also arthropods like this beetle, they make their cell walls or their exoskeleton out of chitin, which looks very similar to cellulose. It is also a long straight chain. Now, the big difference here is, remember, those branching chains of starch and glycogen were easy to break down to use for energy to get those monosaccharides. These long, thin chains are harder to break down, and that's good because we don't want to break them down. The purpose is not for energy, the purpose is for them to be strong. And so the long chains are stronger and hard to break down. All right, now let's go to lipids. Now remember, lipids are for long-term energy storage. And there's kind of two main types of storage: fats. Remember, triglycerides are the ones that are most common in our body. And these tend to be what we call saturated, which means they have straight fatty acid chains, so they can kind of stack up. Think of like a pile of flat papers could stack easily. Then the other type of energy storage lipid is oils. These are a little bit more common in plants, and these usually have what we call unsaturated chains, which means that they're sort of bendy and kinky, which means they can't stack nicely. Think if you crumple up a piece of paper, it doesn't stack up very nicely anymore. So because they don't stack nicely, they're usually liquid at room temperature. So a fat, of course, is something like butter, And those are what the fatty acid chains look like, long and straight, so they stack nicely. And oils would be something like olive oil. And you can see the fatty acid chains are all over the place. They're kinky. They have what's called double bonds in them. You'll learn about those in chemistry. So because they can't stack nicely, they are liquids at room temperature. And when we get energy from them, those long fatty acid chains are what provide the energy. Now, there's lots of other lipids that are not so much for energy. They have other functions. So we already mentioned way back that the cell membrane has these important lipids called phospholipids. Cholesterol, which we think of as a bad thing, and too much of it can be, but it's also an important part of keeping our cell membranes strong. There's waxes, things like beeswax, and some whales have waxes, and we have earwax. All waxes are actually a type of lipid. And then there's steroids, which I know that steroid sounds like a bad thing, but some steroids are actually important for our body. So are those hormones I mentioned back at the beginning, like sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, are actually technically steroids. Corticosteroids are things like cortisone that you would actually use as like your anti-itch medicine. And then there's anabolic steroids, which are related to testosterone. And there are natural steroids, but also the ones you probably thought of when I said steroids, the illegal kind, which are actually based on the sex hormone testosterone in some ways. So they're related, and that's why it's kind of like having the extreme testosterone that gives you bigger muscles and things like that, but of course can negatively affect the body in a lot of ways as well. So here's a picture of the cell membrane. So the purple parts are the phospholipids, but you can see the cholesterol is kind of in there too. The cholesterol is what makes it so the cell membrane is not too loosey-goosey. It helps give it a little bit more of a firm structure. A little bit of a wax example there. And that's what the wax looks like chemically. So corticosteroids, I mentioned, we have natural ones in our body, but we also use them as medicines. And that's a picture of an anabolic steroid there, which if you look at it next to a picture of testosterone, very, very similar. All right, so that is the end of our part 1. Starting later in the next class, we will start talking about how we actually get energy from these energy molecules. Thanks so much for watching.